What's going on, YouTube? It's Tom here, back with another video today. This one's going to be a long one, so find yourself a comfy seat, grab some popcorn, and get ready. So in this one, we're going to talk about maximizing performance in your knives. This is something that I've kind of been thinking about for a while, and I kind of think about on a daily basis or when I'm making knife decisions, and I see a lot of misinformation out there about what goes into the performance of knives and just how much each factor affects it. So I'm going to kind of talk about all the variables that go into the performance of a knife like this, and I'm going to be talking about it in order of what I think is least to most important. So let's keep in mind that there are extremes for any of these, any of the factors. So before comments come rolling in with all sorts of crazy examples, come on, let's kind of have some common sense here. There are also factors that play a part in performance, like as far as edge retention goes, and there's also others that make use easier and more enjoyable for the end user, and we'll kind of talk about that more as we go. So let's go ahead and hop right in. The first factor, or the least important one, is stock thickness. I see this talked about a lot, talking about how slicey a knife is going to be, how slicey a PM2 is, how slicey, the bug out is, all sorts of stuff like that. Stock thickness plays absolutely zero part in edge retention. It doesn't matter if it's 100 thousandths or 250 thousandths. It plays zero difference in edge retention. Both have the same edge retention if all the other variables between the knives are the exact same. What it does affect, however, is the ease of cutting on materials that are less likely to separate easily. So you can definitely tell the difference in stock thickness when you're cutting stuff like foam and cardboard to a lesser extent. Cardboard if you have like the really thick like 3-wall stuff, but if we're talking about just the normal cardboard, you really don't see it. I just see a lot of people talking about how thin stock means sliciness, and I think they kind of get it confused as being performance driven or being like just ease of cutting. I would classify this as like the third most important factor in regards to ease of cutting. Number 6 is behind the edge thickness. Steve has an excellent video comparing two Manly Wasps in 12C27 that are identical to each other than behind the edge thickness. And the difference is negligible on cardboard. But on cardboard, like the difference was like less than 1% or something. It was just, there was nothing there. I'm not sure we have enough testing on other materials to say that it makes absolutely zero difference though, so that's kind of why I put it at 6. And not kind of like tie it at 7 with stock thickness. Where it does play a difference is it makes a significant difference in ease of cutting. A thinner knife behind the edge, like this native here that I had reground, is so easy to cut through materials. It just glides, especially if you couple that with one of our other variables here that I'll be talking about in a little bit. But something thin like this native or this Shark from Steingraber Performance Knives, it's night and day. Once you use something like these, you don't want to go back to a regular production knife like the original native that I have in Maximate. You just don't want to go back to it. It also makes sharpening a ton easier just because of the fact that there's way less material sitting back here behind the edge, behind the shoulder. There's way less material to take off. We'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit as well because I have an example of that. Also because of that, you can take these knives to much lower edge angles without a ton of work since there's less material to remove. And you can take them super low without making the bevels look ridiculously huge. So I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but on this native, this is rocking an 18 degree per side bevel. And the bevel's kind of big. I mean, it's not, I'd say it's average for a Spyderco bevel. When you talk about this native here that's been reground, you can see just how small that bevel is, and that bevel is sitting at 14 degrees aside. So you can go considerably lower without making that bevel look obnoxiously huge. Number 5 is one that I see overlooked a lot. Edge finish and the abrasives used in sharpening. So this is all really dependent on steel type. Certain steels prefer more coarse or more refined edges. You can kind of play around with this and figure out what works best for you. Pete at Cedric and Ada has a pretty good catalog of videos showing this. He does like the coarse versus polished test. I know Gerald's starting to do it. I'm going to start doing it here soon, just so you can kind of see which steels like a more coarse or a more refined finish. You got to play around with this and figure out what works best for you. I like to track what I'm cutting so I can see actual data of what each edge cuts in daily use, so I can make the best decision on what performs the best. The major part of this, though, is abrasives used. And it's so key to use the proper abrasives for the steel, or most importantly, the carbides that you're cutting. Triple B talks about this a lot, and you do see a major difference if you use the proper abrasives. Too many times I see guys using stones that aren't nearly hard enough to be sharpening some of these high-performance steels, K390, Maximate, Rex 121, M4, Rex 45, all that good stuff. The steel hardness itself isn't really the issue. It's the carbide hardness. Carbides can be much harder than the steel matrix that they're surrounded by. So like this K390 PM2 is coming in between 63 to 64. Most stones are going to be able to abrade that. Like, that's not crazy hard for most stones. But when you start thinking about the carbides that are inside of it, vanadium, vanadium's the main one, I believe, in K390. But that is much, much, much harder than the steel matrix around it, and most stones aren't going to be able to touch that. If your stones aren't hard enough to abrade those carbides, you're just going to wear the matrix around them, which leads to a weaker edge since they aren't firmly secured any longer. Your edge is also going to be more refined since the carbides are being shaped instead of left all jagged with all that material missing around them. You can kind of see what I'm talking about right here. So in this picture from scienceofsharp.com, I'll leave a link down in the description. Awesome website. This is an awesome article. This is Maximate. You can see the little white pieces or the lighter colored pieces here are actually the carbides. You can see how they're flat and flush with the rest of the steel. Now I cropped this picture on purpose because this edge was sharpened on a wicked edge. This is a 600 and 1500 diamond progression. You can see that basically everything's flat and flush with the rest of the steel. Now compare that with the full image here. You can see I cropped the top portion of that picture, which is what we just looked at. The bottom portion was actually micro beveled with a natural Japanese stone, or Japanese water stone, which definitely is not hard enough to abrade the carbides at Maximate. And you can see just how much of those carbides are sitting out and how jagged at the edge is, and just how loosely those carbides are held into the surrounding steel matrix. This was also seen in the original edge retention testing I did on this Native 5 here in Maximate, the original one that I did all of the Maximate experience with. This thing's sitting at 69.2 HRC with those super hard tungsten and vanadium carbides. And when I initially edge retention tested it, I finished it with the 1200 and 1600 grit ceramics, which I believe are an aluminum oxide based stone. And obviously aluminum oxide is not hard enough to abrade the carbides in there. I got a good result, but I talked to Triple B a little bit about the result of it, and he convinced me to do a full diamond progression. So when I did a full diamond progression, it picked up another 143 feet of cardboard, which was 21.73% more. So just making that one simple change changed the edge retention by over 20%. So it's so important to be using the correct abrasives. Triple B has an awesome chart showing carbide hardness for different types of carbides on Blade forums. I'm going to link that in the description below as well. You guys should definitely go check that out. If you're not sure on if your stone's hard enough, figure out what type of carbide your steel has in it. Vanadium, tungsten, others as well. And research your stone hardness for the type of abrasives that it uses, and just make the best decision that you can regarding that. Now, to be noted, CBN and diamond are always safe bets. And again, when we're talking about these, I'm not talking just stones in general. I'm talking about stropping as well. So using something like CBN emulsion, like I have here, is also key. There's no point in going with a full diamond progression all the way up until you're stropping, and then you're using the green like paste compound, like that's all just aluminum oxide. You're wearing down the integrity of your edge a little bit at that point. So full diamond progression, full CBN, something like that. Stuff that's definitely hard enough to abrade the carbides that are in your steel. On to number 4, and that's going to be edge angle. Edge angle affects both edge retention and ease of cutting. The thinner the edge is, the easier it's going to cut through material because there's less material there at the apex, and it's just going to start into your cut and continue through your cut way easier. Couple that with an edge that's thin behind the edge, like this guy here, and you have a knife that is an absolute joy to use. Just super easy to cut, and it's going to cut forever. You might be asking how it affects edge retention though. Now looking at edge angle, I have two different edges sitting here on the screen. I've got one that's at 15 degrees per side, and I've got another one that is at 25 degrees per side. Obviously these are not to scale, just kind of a visual example. Sharpness is determined on how wide your apex is at the bottom. So at your apex here, the width of that, the smaller you get that, the sharper the knife edge is going to be. At a certain point, it's going to stop being sharp, and it's going to be an edge that we're going to classify as dull because that apex gets a little bit too wide. Now, if you look over here at the 15 degree per side one, and my slide thing keeps popping up here, so it's kind of hard to see, but it stays thinner for way, way, way further up here. So for something, let's say this point right here is the point that it becomes dull. To get to that width over here on the 25 degrees per side, you probably have to go half that distance. So being at a lower edge angle like that increases your edge retention just because the edge, the actual apex, stays smaller for a longer period of time. The amount of wear for a 15 degree per side edge to get dull is significantly more than a 25 degree per side edge to get to that same point, just because like we looked at on that PowerPoint slide. The lower you take your edge angle though, like this guy at 14 degrees per side, the more susceptible it is to edge damage. So you'll have to kind of play around with different angles and see what works best for your uses because everybody's different. I'm really just slicing a whole bunch of cardboard and stuff, so I can go pretty low and just keep in my mind that I can't do many twisting motions, putting lateral pressure on the edge, that kind of thing. You just kind of have to determine what works best for your use. I'd kind of suggest starting out at around 20 degrees per side and then dropping it by 1 or 2 degrees per side every time you sharpen. Until you notice more damage than usual. If you try and drop it more than that, you're just going to be spending more time sharpening, which is why I suggest to go 1 or 2 degrees per side at a time, just so you're saving your time. This will also vary from steel to steel, and heat treat and microstructure of the steel will determine how low you can take these edge angles. We'll kind of talk about that here a little bit more in the next couple of points. Number 3 is Rockwell hardness, or HRC. It's no secret that hard steel is going to cut longer than soft steel. This SPK Shark at 66 is going to cut longer than this K390 PM2 at 63 to 64. It's just the way that it is. Of course, there's going to be limits to what certain steels can be taken to, but if the steel is taken to its maximum usable hardness, it's going to perform its best. S30V, for example, at 61 is going to outperform S30V at 57 if all other things are equal. That's just pretty much common sense. Number 2 is going to be steel type, and you can almost swap this and HRC since they're so dependent on each other. Obviously, you can't take something like S30V to 70 HRC like you could Rex 121. The composition of a steel and the types of carbides it's going to form dictate the max HRC that it can be run at. The types of carbides and the sheer volume of them is what drives edge retention from a composition standpoint. So like Maximate has a ton of carbides and a ton of high hardness carbides, as well as the steel matrix being able to get hard because of its composition, which is what leads to its high edge retention. Compare that to something like S30V that only has really vanadium carbides, and because of its composition can only be run to like 61, 62, somewhere in that range. It's just not going to cut as long because the steel composition just isn't there, the steel type. And first and foremost, we have heat treat. This is the most important factor of performance, and it's not really even close. Heat treat makes or breaks a knife. Let's give an example real quick. I know that Steve had a Maximate Mannix, and his came in at like 66 HRC or something, and it performs nowhere close to what this one at 69.2 does. Same steel, same composition, but the heat treat's different, but the specs for the heat treat were different on his batch compared to this batch, and this batch obviously is going to cut longer because it's harder, like we talked about in the last point. Many people think that a steel is going to perform just because it has a certain name. M390, for example. We've seen that a lot in the past couple of years. proper heat treat helps the steel realize its true chemical potential. If I take Maximate here and I heat treat it to 62 HRC, just because it's Maximate doesn't mean it's going to cut for 700 feet of cardboard like this one did. It has to be heat treated correctly. And I'm not talking about just taking it to a certain hardness either. I'm talking about a good heat treat that's going to limit grain growth and has proper carbide distribution while hitting your target hardness. Those other two factors are they're more important than your HRC. If you have a heat treat that hits all of those, it's going to outperform those with a subpar heat treat, regardless of if they're the same steel type. A good microstructure is absolutely key. You might find one of the extremely rare production knives out there that has an excellent heat treat, but the best way to get them is through a trusted custom maker. It's going to be more expensive because of all the R&D and the time that went into tweaking that heat treat to make it custom, but that's the only place you're going to find truly ultimate performance. Guys out there that are leading the charge in that are like Triple B and Roman at K-Knives Switzerland. A good example of steel with good microstructure that cuts longer than others that are the same steel at the same hardness is Chris Reeves S35VN or Roman's M390 at 62 HRC versus Spyderco M390 at 62 HRC. You guys can go watch that video on Outpost 76's channel. He did a whole video on that. But the difference between a good heat treat, maximizing the performance of a knife, and not just HRC is pretty apparent. A good microstructure like those examples leads to more performance at a certain hardness while being easier to sharpen, and you can bring the edge back easier through stropping. Gerald, when he was doing one of the most recent tests on Roman's knives, mentioned stropping one of those super high performance steels back just on cardboard, which is absolutely insane, and it just showcases just how good Roman's heat treat was. So with saying all that, I want to say you should focus on the variables that you can control. Number one, easiest one to control is edge angle or the edge finish and abrasives used. So take the edge angle as low as your uses allow and use the proper abrasives for the steel type that you're using. Another one that you can kind of control is your behind the edge thickness. You can send any of your knives out to these guys that are offering regrind services, like Brian over at Transparent Knives or Alex at Steingraber Performance Knives. And they're going to take these knives down to thin behind the edge thicknesses that are going to cut like laser beams for you, like this guy right here. The other variables, HRC, stock thickness, steel type, heat treat, are going to be determined by the maker. So it's kind of out of your control. You can kind of control that a little bit if you're working with a custom maker, or obviously at this point we kind of know what brands tend to nail their heat treat and actually care about the performance of their knives. So with this whole topic, I kind of decided to do a test to kind of showcase how maximizing performance of a certain knife can help. I took this Steingraber Performance Knives Shark in K390, and this was one of his initial ones. He's done quite a few runs since then. But this one is sitting at 65.9 HRC, and it's sharpened at 13 degrees per side. I'm not sure how easy it's going to be able to see how small that bevel is at 13 degrees per side, but sharpened it with a full diamond progression, and it's sitting at 12 thousandths behind the edge right now. Absolute laser beam. So I went ahead and cut cardboard with this until it would no longer cut computer paper, and I've never really tested this one before. I just kind of used it at work, used it at home here whenever I get a chance if I need to do some extended cutting, because it's super comfortable to cut with and easy to cut with because of the thin stock and the thin behind the edge thickness. But this one ended up cutting 549.94 feet, which is the second best result ever, and the third result that we've ever had crack 500 feet. So extremely impressed with this, but let's kind of compare that to the PM2 in K390. Same steel, obviously, but this one is at 63 to 64, which is what this whole run seems to be coming at. That I'm just assuming this is 63 to 64 at 18 degrees per side, and this is sitting at 28 thousandths behind the edge. When we tested this last time with the same progression that we used on that Shark there, it cut 480.38 feet. So a pretty significant difference. It's a 13.5% difference, which may not seem like a lot, but the ease of cutting and sharpening is so obvious between the two. So when we're talking about sharpening this guy last night, I actually had to sharpen it up last night before I tested this. This thing, from start to finish, 200, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit diamond progression, took 5.5 minutes to get through that. 5.5 minutes, which is stupid, at 13 degrees per side. The PM2 at 18 degrees per side takes over 20 minutes, which is, 4 times as long to sharpen this as it is to sharpen this. On top of that, the shark is so much easier to deburr. It was ready to rock right off the stones. It really didn't need any stropping. If that wasn't part of the progression that I used to test, I wouldn't have done it because it didn't need it. It was ready to rock right off the stones with almost no effort to actually deburr it. The PM2 actually takes a little bit more time and a little bit more care to get to that same point, just because obviously the heat treat isn't quite as good. Not saying it's not good, but it's not quite as good. Both are great, but the difference is really night and day, and the price isn't really that different. This comes in at like $180. The Shark comes in at like $250. I think that's what it was on the initial run. I'm not sure if his prices have changed since then, but really the difference is night and day for as little of a price difference as it is. So if you guys really want to maximize the performance of your knives, kind of keep these variables in mind and do your best to control what you can. Like I said during the video, I'm going to put links to all like the resources that I used for this and stuff that I showed throughout the video. I'll put that in the description so you guys can go take a look at the articles and stuff for yourself. Extremely useful stuff. Through making this video, I really learned how big of a knife nerd I've become over the past couple of years and how much I've learned, and is thanks to the guys that have those resources out and readily available. With that being said, I think that's going to do it for me today, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope this didn't run on too long. If you guys enjoyed it, make sure to drop a like down below and hit that subscribe button to continue to see videos just like this one. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.